Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Reena George from the Department of Continuing Medical Education, and we welcome you to the second Heritage Lecture by Professor M.S. Seshadri on learning and teaching in medicine. Our program today will be moderated by another eminent medical educator, Dr. Anand Zachariah, Professor of Medicine, who himself has made vital contributions to very needy areas of medical education, from distance education for HIV professionals to snake bites, clerkship for MBBS graduates, the Vision 2015 document. Thank you both for participating in this program. And I hand over to Dr. Zachariah to introduce his teacher, Professor M.S. Seshadri.
So I would be preferred to be introduced as Dr. Seshadri's student. And he graduated as a gold medalist from the Madras University from the Coimbatore Medical College in 1972. He did his post-graduation in medicine from CMC Vellore between 1974 and 77 and worked his whole career for about 34 years, first in the Department of Medicine, and then he set up the endocrinology department, and he worked till 2011. At his retirement, he joined the Tirumalai Medical Mission Hospital in Ranipet and has been working there in a mission hospital since then, providing medical services to the community around. Dr. Seshadri is a teacher who molded you. My memories of him stretch to the early 80s when, as a medical student, I attended interdepartmental meetings and CME programs where he explained clearly, based on his experience, the approach to common endocrine problems. I was a PG registrar under him in the early 90s in medicine too. And I remember taking care of many of his patients, Cushing's disease, neurosarcoidosis, evaluation of hypoglycemia. On his rounds, he would retake the history, checking information and the physical findings. What we learned was an organized and precise way in which he approached each case. We had to work up endocrine cases in the OPD, and he would make corrections on our OPD notes, which are still there in the charts, which helped us to improve. His razor-sharp thought process helped us to organize our diagnostic thinking. Dr. A.M. Cherian and Dr. Seshadri used to take combined PG clinics once a week, and they were a formidable combination. There were classic clinics by Dr. Seshadri, such as on Wilson's disease, where he taught us to use the ophthalmoscope to diagnose a KF ring. There was a case of PUO where a medical student picked up a peripheral artery aneurysm, which helped clinch the diagnosis of polyarteritis nodosa. The medical student presented the case in the clinical meeting, and Dr. Seshadri emphasized that even a medical student can come to an unusual diagnosis by a careful physical examination. Every week we had to present an article at the journal club, and he helped us to learn how to evaluate scientific evidence. He always emphasized that scientific evidence takes time to accumulate, and we must be slow to change our practice based on one clinical trial. I remember one of my co-PGs was having difficulty in completing his thesis. He sat with him on a Saturday afternoon and literally dictated his thesis, which was of impeccable quality. We were all quite scared of Dr. A.M. Cherian, but Dr. Seshadri befriended us. He would take us down for coffee to YWCA canteen and ask us about our problems, what we were reading. During my posting, me and my co-PG fell sick under stress, and Dr. Seshadri literally held the second call pager for many weeks, doing evening rounds and answering night calls. He had many pithy comments, which we continue to use in our teaching. know 50 drugs well. You can take care of 95% of conditions. He had an old stethoscope, and when the diaphragm broke, he would take an X-ray film, cut out a diaphragm, and replace it. With it, he would pick up the faint mid-diastolic murmur of MS which we had missed, and he would say that it is more important what is between the earpieces rather than the stethoscope. My aunt was his patient for her entire life. She had a common set of problems: hypothyroidism, cervical spondylosis, and a difficult life. She would come every year to meet him. I wondered why she came when she could very well have been looked after in her hometown in Kerala. The important thing was that he listened to her carefully and gave her simple advice, and every time she felt so much better after seeing Shesh. He was her physician. I realized that regularity, but punctuality, consistency, and discipline are what make a physician. Most of what I have told you relates to about 25 years ago. Even after he moved to start the endocrine department, we regarded him as a physician and not as an endocrinologist. His endocrine wards were full of pneumonias, fevers, and other common medical problems, and he continues his active involvement in the Department of General Medicine, where he even took a PG clinic this week at the online conference. He has influenced the formation of many generations of students, a physician and teacher of the old mold. It is people like him who have made us who we are. We too strive to pass on some of these lessons we have learned from him to future generations. And so I'm really happy to be chairing the session of my teacher, to Dr. Sheshadri. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anand, for a very nice introduction. I'd just like to tell you, I still retain that old stethoscope. I haven't parted company with it yet. Okay, thanks very much for asking me to talk about teaching and learning. I'll start off with a quotation from Khalil Gibran. A good teacher takes the student to the threshold of his own knowledge. What exactly is implied is that the teacher should build on what the learner already knows. Acknowledge that the learner has an innate knowledge of the subject that is being taught, and the teacher should know what the learner already knows and stimulate the student's innate curiosity and lead him as he learns on his own. Learning is like construction. You need a foundation and then you build on it. The stronger the foundation, the higher you can go. Teaching and learning are actually two sides of the same coin. In order to teach, you have to learn a lot. In order to learn, you have to teach more and more. The more you teach, the more you learn. And the more you teach, the greater the clarity in your own mind. For those of you who are teaching, you will be familiar with this process, a cycle of teaching and learning. The teacher has to learn a lot in order to teach the student. The student in turn learns and learns on his own as well. And eventually he teaches his teacher. Now, if you look at the medical curriculum from the undergraduate's point of view, it has an overlapping nature. You study the basic sciences in your first year. Subsequently, you move on to paramedical subjects, path, microbiology, pharmacology. Then you come on to the clinical years where you are trained in the art and science of dealing with patients. And you go through internship where you have hands-on experience in managing patients under supervision. I would just like to recount my own experiences as a student and how these experiences have influenced the way I teach. As Anand pointed out, I completed my MBBS from a government medical college in Coimbatore. I did my MD from CMC Vellore. And then I did my PhD from Sydney University, Australia. At all these places of learning, I was profoundly influenced by extraordinary teachers. I learned different aspects of the art and science of teaching. We must all acknowledge that we constantly learn from all the people around us. As an undergraduate, I learned from my teachers. As a postgraduate, I learned from teachers and my colleagues. As a junior consultant, I learned from my seniors. As a senior consultant, I learned from my juniors. And when I became a professor, I started learning exclusively almost from my students. All along, I learned a lot of practical skills from all the healthcare workers who work with us. From the time I started teaching, of course, my students were a great source of inspiration and they taught me. All through my career, I have learned a great deal from my patients. Whenever I have been confronted with a difficult to solve problem, an imprint of what I have learned from any one or all of these people comes to my rescue. I will illustrate these points with a few anecdotes. After all, storytelling, in my opinion, is the best way to teach. As an undergraduate, we had a truly remarkable anatomy teacher, Dr. Punnaswamy. The analogy in CMC would be Professor Harsha, I believe. Both of them shared a unique gift, the ability to draw simple diagrams. The blackboard was the medium, colored pieces of chalk the tool, and the blackboard would be magically transformed and phenomenal line diagrams were the product. They could hold the attention of a class of 100 students and they could hold them spellbound for several hours at a stretch. Now look at this simple diagram. It's a picture of the heart in the thoracic cage. Now this picture can replace a lot of text when you are teaching students. You can teach students which are the areas where you auscultate. You can teach an ECG technician where the leads have to be placed for a correct recording of the electrocardiogram. I learned a very important skill, how to draw simple line diagrams. And a simple label diagram can readily convey your ideas and can easily replace a lot of text. I have greatly profited from this technique of conveying my ideas. During the clinical years, we were taught how to get a bird's eye view of the patient. This used to be called the general physical examination. This has helped me greatly in my practice of medicine. The facial appearance and manner of the patient, his awareness of his surroundings, the mood, behavior, speech, movement, gait, alertness, response to questions, and the clarity with which a patient can give his history. All these tell you a little bit about the whole personality, and you need to be actively listening to and looking at the patient when you go through this process. A 65-year-old retired civil servant was brought to me by his wife for anxiety episodes and insomnia. His son, at the age of 39, was still unsettled, and the wife thought this was the reason for his symptoms. When he walked in, he was slow and cautious. He did have a stoop. When he spoke, his speech was lifeless. Physical examination was otherwise normal. All these features could have been passed on for depression, but there was something about him that reminded me of a problem I had seen before. My professor in Coimbatore Medical College had shown me a similar patient in a busy outpatient department. And as soon as the patient entered the room and sat down, he saw that the patient was a bit slow and very methodical. He asked him to write on a piece of paper his name, and this is what the patient wrote. The handwriting was very good, but the letters became progressively smaller. He just asked him one question: how long since your handwriting changed? And the patient said 5 years. I followed the same tactic in this patient and I had a diagnosis. A diagnosis of Parkinsonism was made in this patient following the footsteps of my teacher. A 70-year-old diabetic under my care for the past 2 years with good glycemic control and no hypoglycemic episodes, was brought for unusual behavior for the last 4 weeks. She was not her usual self. She was looking distraught and upset. She was unable to explain what was wrong with her, and the relatives said, "She acts funny at home." I asked him, "In what way?" He said, "After bath, she forgets to dress herself fully and comes out. But she doesn't realize that she has actually done that." The physical examination was normal. I did not do a detailed neurological examination because it was not really necessary. Her symptoms rang a bell. I remembered Professor Jacob Abraham showing us a patient with very similar symptoms. The patient was actually neglecting a part of herself. He told us, "You go and read up and find out when this happens." I read up and learned that a parietal lobe lesion can cause this. I suspected that this patient had a parietal lobe lesion, and that was perhaps the reason for her coming out half dressed. And imaging confirmed the diagnosis: a large parietal lobe lesion with surrounding edema, a glioblastoma. All of us actually carry a bit of our teachers within ourselves, and at odd moments, they resurface and they guide us imperceptibly. I'm sure all of you who are practicing medicine have had this kind of experience. Most often, if you retrospect, it is a bedside clinical discussion on a given patient, a very complex impression that is ingrained in our mind, which surfaces when we need it most. A 78-year-old male with altered sensorium was the patient. The son, a doctor, said that it had evolved over the past 2 weeks. The patient was habituated to alcohol. The family felt that he may have overdone this. He was drowsy on examination, but arousable, responded to calls. He had a pulse rate of 64 and a blood pressure of 170/80. The most prominent physical finding was a flapping tremor. Systemic examination was normal. There was no focal neurological deficit. So we suspected in the context that he might have a hepatic encephalopathy, a very reasonable clinical diagnosis. But his liver functions and prothrombin time were quite normal. He had a normal hemogram, normal electrolytes, normal creatinine, and we were a bit puzzled. A lesson learned during a clinical session flash pass. Professor P.T. Raman's clinic on a patient with altered sensorium. The patient had a flapping tremor but no localizing signs. We diagnosed metabolic encephalopathy on this patient, and Professor Raman said all that flaps is not hepatic or metabolic encephalopathy. Just go and look up. He showed us that the patient had early papilledema, and the patient actually had an intracranial space occupying lesion. We went and looked up and found that a flapping tremor can occur in any brainstem dysfunction, including that caused by intracranial space occupying lesions. I spoke to the son again. 2 months earlier, the patient had a fall while coming downstairs. He had injured his occiput and required a couple of stitches. Alcohol habituation, head injury, and altered sensorium led to a totally different line of thinking and reasoning. And this is what we eventually found: a subdural hematoma displacing the midline found on imaging. Indeed, Professor Raman was right. All that flaps is not metabolic encephalopathy. He taught us how we can question dogma. We learn a lot as we go along from our peers and colleagues, and I will illustrate this. A 38-year-old male with a 10 kg weight loss in the preceding 6 months. He had recurrent diarrhea and poor appetite. He had extensive vitiligo, no fever or constitutional symptoms. The father had been treated for tuberculosis. He had had a PPD done outside that was positive. The differential diagnosis was malabsorption or intestinal tuberculosis. This was the pre-endoscopy days, and the test available to us was a barium meal follow-through, which was actually performed. During rounds, Dr. Kuruvillavarki, we used to call him KV, He spent a lot of time looking at this X-ray. This is what the patient looked like. He had this big patches of vitiligo, and he was thin. And this is what Dr. KV was looking at. You are looking at these radio opaque shadows on either side of the vertebral column. He asked us, what do you think? We said this may be residual barium in the bowel. But the appearance of residual barium in the bowel is very different. This is not typical. So Dr. KV asked us, could this be adrenal calcification? This question changed the entire line of thinking. We checked his electrolytes and found that he had hyponatremia, hyperkalemia, and a normal creatinine. We did not have access to cortisol estimations then, but we still had a diagnosis of primary adrenal insufficiency. Vitiligo in this patient partly marks the pigmentation of Addison's disease. Addison's original description itself was in a patient with vitiligo. And there's a well-known association between vitiligo and Addison's disease. I learned a lesson. We should not disregard any abnormality in an X-ray. And if it doesn't look typical, then you need to go and look at it again. And remember that features of another disease in the patient may mask the features of a particular disease. In this case, vitiligo masking the hyperpigmentation of Addison's. And it's not enough if you have these bits of information. You need to see how best you can put the pieces of the puzzle together. After all, a clinical diagnosis is all about solving puzzles. A 40-year-old male was admitted with bilateral pneumonia. He started on IV antibiotics, but he rapidly worsened and developed acute respiratory failure. He was intubated, ventilated. He improved over the next 3 days. X-ray improved. However, we were not able to wean him off. During rounds, Dr. Kurulavaki noticed that the patient was alert and awake, but his eyes were closed. When he asked the patient to open his eyes, the patient tried hard. And this is what it looked like. He was contracting his frontalis muscle to the extent that he was furrowing his eyebrows, but he was not able to open his eyes. And there was a slight divergent squint. And KV had arrived at a diagnosis. He knew then why this patient could not be weaned off the ventilator. A tensilon test was performed and that confirmed the diagnosis of myasthenia gravis. And this was another important lesson I learned at the bedside, which I passed on to my students. When you have a patient who is difficult to wean off the ventilator, there are some simple things that you can do at the bedside to see whether there is a problem with neuromuscular function. We all learn a lot from our students. I will illustrate this. There was a 12-year-old boy with a 3-year history of recurrent convulsions, admitted repeatedly at the neurology department. Every time he was admitted, he had low serum potassium and an elevated bicarbonate. The blood pressure was always normal. He would be treated with IV fluids and potassium chloride, and he would recover. And during one such admission, a consultation was sent to our department. One of my trainees saw the patient. She came to me and said, I want you to see this patient. I said, see, hypokalemic alkalosis without hypertension. It must be Bartter syndrome. She told me, I thought of it, sir, but he has convulsions. And indeed, convulsions are not commonly seen in Bartter syndrome. She was not happy with my suggestion for a diagnosis, and she insisted that I come and see the patient. So I went along with her to the ward. The youngster looked quite happy. The mother was very distraught. I asked the mother, how is he coping with school? She just broke down and said, you're not doing well at all. The child was under the care of indulgent grandparents, and he was playing truant at school. The question in my mind was whether the child was bringing on the medical problem to escape school. But I was quite puzzled. How was he bringing on hypokalemic alkalosis? I asked the mother if the child had access to any tablets. She said he liberally helps himself to his grandparents' medication. The teacher once caught him trying to distribute tablets to his classmates. The grandfather was actually on sodium bicarbonate. We looked up and found that excessive alkali ingestion can reproduce all the symptoms and can also cause convulsions by lowering ionized serum calcium. But why was he doing this? He seemed a smart enough kid. So I rang up a former student working in psychiatry and explained the situation to her. She said she will see him. The child had a consultation with her. And she rang me up the next day. She said, "Sir, the child has dyslexia. He cannot even write the name of his school. He cannot read simple sentences. But he is very quick to grasp what he hears." No wonder the child was bored with school. We spoke to the family. They opted for vocational training in a nearby agricultural university. Now, about 12 years later, this young man, he teaches farmers how to use scientific principles in farming. He learned all this through verbal communication. He earns his living and he is well settled. These two students have taught me very important lessons. If you do not understand the puzzle and if you want to solve it, you have to go to the bedside. You cannot sort it out sitting in your office. In a child who dislikes school, there may be a genuine underlying disability. If only I had asked the child to write on a piece of paper by the bedside, I could have easily made this diagnosis of dyslexia. It was such a simple thing. It didn't occur to me. Only if you recognize the disability, you can help the child. You can transform a life. How can one learn from others in the workplace? I said often I work from other people in the workplace, not necessarily in my department. I accompanied a close relative of mine with acute vertigo to the ENT department. The attending doctor, a former student, listened very patiently to the story. She did a simple clinical test by the bedside called Hallpike's test. She said the test was positive and showed me that there was nystagmus. And she proceeded to perform a maneuver, Epley's maneuver. After this, the symptoms dramatically vanished. Well, now I'm working in a secondary level hospital. I have to deal with a number of patients who present with this identical problem. I learned this technique. I taught this to my colleagues and to our physiotherapists. I found YouTube videos of how to do these procedures and have them available in the hospital where I work for any doctor who comes in to learn. I've shared this with my colleagues and the physiotherapists, and a number of patients who come to our hospital with this problem have benefited. We don't have a full-time ENT surgeon. I developed an acute back problem and had a course of anti-inflammatory drugs. I read up, I found a set of lumbar core muscle strengthening exercises. I started practicing them. I got better by about 70%, but there was residual disability which was lasting well beyond a year. I consulted spinal surgery in CMC and they sent me to physiotherapy. A physiotherapy consultant in CMC asked me to do the exercises that I was already doing, and he just made a very few simple corrections. And these corrections made such a huge difference. I benefited greatly by adopting them. Now, I've taught these techniques to the physiotherapists in our secondary level hospital, and this has benefited a lot of patients who come to us. The learn, practice, teach approach works very well for common disorders. How do I use all that I've learned to teach? I use simple line diagrams and a white or blackboard. That is my preferred medium for teaching. Teaching with a slideshow in the darkened classroom, I find is often soporific. I try to pass on the pearls of wisdom I've learned from my teachers. Never ignore a patient's symptoms. Pay close attention to the overall appearance of the patient. Listen to dogma, but learn to question it and find the answers. Give your intuition a chance. Do not bury your intuitions with too much reasoning. Every piece of the puzzle is important, and make sure you have all the pieces. And I personally prefer interactive teaching to didactic teaching because it allows for a discourse between the student and the taught. How about teaching in the context of research? A research question often arises at the bedside, but teaching by the bedside is a little different from guiding research. I learned this when I did my PhD under Professor Solomon Posen in Sydney. I had done my MD thesis by that time and I had a vague idea about research, but a PhD was a totally different proposition. I had very limited exposure to laboratory medicine. When I first met him, Professor Posen told me, the most valuable thing is your time here. The lab is at your disposal. Order whatever reagent or equipment you need, and then you're on. Just update me once a month. He gave me a recent review related to my research. The terms were very, very generous, but I was literally seeing stars. My research area was to set up an adenyl cyclase bioassay for parathyroid hormone. I sat and read in the library for the first 3 months. When I next met Prof, he said, "Where have you reached? I hope you're not wasting your time." I told him I was reading up. He said, "Summarize and tell me as if I am a 5-year-old." Difficult task, but I did it. He said, "Let me ask you a very ignorant question. Someone in this lab has been trying to get this test up and going for the last 1 year. It has not worked out. Why?" I said, "Sir, for my reading, it has to do with too much calcium in the assay mixture." And I outlined a few simple experiments to sort this out. He said, "Yes, okay, go ahead, do all this, come back with the results." I proved my point in my next session with Prof. And then he came up with the next ignorant question. By the time I had answered 7 of these ignorant questions, my thesis was done. Each question and its solution resulted in a chapter in my thesis and in a research publication. I realized the role of the research guide. A research guide has to have an overall view, has to be very knowledgeable, summarize a lot of information, and be smart enough to identify areas of uncertainty. And these areas of uncertainty are where research questions arise. He has to help the scholar to formulate the research question, and he has to challenge the research scholar with these questions. And one question leads to another. Eventually, a piece of the puzzle is actually solved. A guide needs to have an overall knowledge and guide research. It is actually up to the research scholar to deal with the nuts and bolts of research. The department in Sydney had a narrow research focus, bone and mineral metabolism. Many renowned researchers from other areas in endocrinology visited the department and gave us lectures. I realized when I returned to India, I need to start from scratch. The focus in CMC was patient care, education, and research. So, research was the last of the 3 objectives. In India, an endocrinology department will have to have a broad focus. You cannot have a separate department only for bone and mineral metabolism. You need to attract interested youngsters and retain them. And each of these youngsters should have an area of primary research focus. My role would be that of a catalyst to accelerate the process. When I returned and started the department, the first academic course in the department was a PhD program. I was now the guide, and some of my trainees opted to register for a PhD. Our clinical trainees who are doing their DipNB got involved in research as part of their thesis requirement. My task was to provide direction and have an overall view of how research was going on in the department and to make sure that there is a common thread and purpose behind the research. Each of the PhD theses led to several publications from the department, and each DipNB or DM thesis also led to 1 or 2 publications. And the department as a whole took a very active and keen interest in research. Several of my students now guide research in the department, and a PhD guide on their own right. Pursuit of relevant research is the backbone of every academic department. The COVID 19 pandemic in early 2020 turned the world upside down. I needed to learn how to get our secondary level hospital to cope with a target population of 35,000 families, a lakh and 60,000 population. I had to devise strategy for coping with COVID and at the same time take care of non-communicable disease, which was our thrust area of work in the hospital. I wrote up protocols for our hospital and for our community, and I discussed them with Professor Jacob John. Professor Jacob John said, share it widely. It will be a good public service. This was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn another skill, how to write in very simple terms for the layman through the print medium. Professor Jacob John is a phenomenal source of inspiration, not only for me, but for several generations of students. I learned the art of simple writing to inform the public, the profession, and the polity. As Professor Jacob John describes it, we have become writing partners. The exercise has been exhilarating. We float ideas, discuss them, write, rewrite, edit, and publish. Remember, Professor Jacob John is more than 80, and I am close to 70. There is no age limit for learning and teaching. I would like to conclude with this profound statement from a 12th century philosopher, Maimonides, who wrote the 8 decrees in the practice of charity. The 8th decree was said to be the most meritorious of all. Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. This can be easily adapted to the teaching, learning situation. Teach a student a lesson, and you have imparted some knowledge. Teach a student how to learn, you've opened up to him a lifetime of learning. Thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you, sir, for that very inspiring lecture. I would request all the participants here to write down your thoughts and questions and the ideas that go through your head as you listen to Dr. Seshadri. What strikes me immediately is the golden nuggets in each of those cases that Dr. Seshadri said were that he has highlighted. The simple use of diagrams, the simple way to diagnose Parkinson's disease just with the handwriting, the history that he noted that a person was not looking after one side of his body that is diagnosed with a parietal tumor, the flapping tremor without any evidence of liver disease, indicating that there was something else going on, and how the diagnosis of Addison's was just made with a hypoadrenalism just based on a plain X-ray. The diagnosis of myasthenia in a patient who had pneumonia in the ICU, and the child who was actually taking soda bicarb tablets and inducing seizures. So there's one set of themes in the lecture about how we learn from individual cases, and all of us will have different examples of that. There are other themes that are coming through the lecture, which are about how teaching is a very important way of learning, and that we learn from many people, of course, our teachers, our colleagues, our students, and finally from the patient itself, and that teaching and learning are so closely linked, and that we do it every day at the bedside. And I think he's also emphasized the importance of the teacher being able to challenge the student and come to help them to pursue lines of research. So I'm reminded of something that Dr. Satya in physiology told me was that her work in Odontolyte poisoning as a physiologist look at the mechanisms of how the Odontolyte plant actually causes hypokalemia was something that Dr. Seshadri challenged her to do, and that led to almost 15 years of research. And I think Dr. Seshadri has highlighted how the teacher's role is often to pose the challenge to the student, which they take on. Uh, each of us will have different kinds of anecdotes about cases that we have learned from and that we share with our youngsters. So I'm going to open this now to discussion. And so, sir, Reena, could you just help me looking at?
I think they have already sent me some questions.
Sure, sir.
Do you
So would
want
you
me
like
to
to
do
start
them?
off?
Do you want
Yeah.
me to
Yeah,
start off with
yeah.
them?
In the order that you choose, sir.
Okay, yeah. There's a very elegant question. How to study medicine in a simple way? Well, I'll tell you the way I do it. I choose very simple and basic textbooks of medicine. Okay, like Davidson. It is actually a fantastic book because it has all the essential basics. You can always build on it, but the basics are stated so well that you have a strong foundation, and building further on it is easier. And I prefer single author textbooks because the style of the book is consistent throughout. Whereas in a multi-author textbook, you'll find that the style varies from chapter to chapter, and that's a bit distracting. I learn on a need to learn basis. I get an overall idea, but when something interests me, I go and read up about it in depth. And I don't postpone that reading because if I postpone it, I'll forget to read. So I note it down. I remember Professor George Cherian in cardiology department. He used to carry a small diary in his pocket. When we go on rounds, he will ask questions, and very often there will not be any answers. And he will just note down the question. And sure enough, next time you see him, he will ask you whether you have looked it up. So that has helped me greatly because I don't postpone looking up. And anything I've read in the context of a patient actually stays with me for a very long time. When I sit and read for reading's sake, it doesn't. The other question is essential principle to impart as teachers to slow and resistant learners. That's an interesting question. I would say there are no slow and resistant learners. There are only impatient teachers who want their students to learn in a hurry. If you know the pace at which the student is capable of learning, and if you are willing to change the pace of your teaching to suit his needs, every student will learn. The third question, a set of questions with regards to digital learning, digital textbooks, tablets, and 3D classrooms. Now, they all have their value. Okay, I think the internet and access to information have greatly revolutionized the way we learn. But still, you need to try and learn what is important and relevant to you and what is contextual. Don't try to read a whole lot about a thing that you have not seen. It doesn't make sense. You read up about things that you see and go further along those lines. You will learn much more in the long run. Somebody has said, we take more time to present than the allotted time. I think it's a common failing as a teacher. So you need to know the time limit. I usually say maximum of 40 slides for a 30-minute lecture. And I might cut it down even further if I have to spend time on each slide. depending upon the time taken per slide, I cut down the slides. Okay. I think I've finished with what questions were sent earlier.
There's one question about, based on your own experience working now in Tirumala Mission Hospital, how do you go about training your doctors, your junior colleagues in a smaller hospital?
I think it's a very, very important question. I think because it is applicable to a very large number of hospitals which work with smaller number of staff. I tell them whatever you cannot sort out by yourself, just bring the patient to me. And every patient who is brought to me for an opinion is an opportunity for me to teach. Same way, when I am seeing a patient, if I find something interesting that I feel my colleagues will learn from, I call them and I show them. Maybe just a physical finding or maybe an aspect of the history, something. And I'll tell them, just go and read up about this. And I find that they are very, very enthusiastic because they are seeing something new and they look up and they come back and tell me. So I follow the Dr. George Cherian tactic. I do note down what I have asked them and I ask them the next time, have you looked it up? And 99% of the time they have.
There's a related question, sir, about students learning differently and with different paces or rates of learning or ways of learning. And how do you address people with different ways in which they learn when you're handling a group?
I think that's why I started off my lecture with that quote from Khalil Gibran. The teacher must first know what the student knows, what is the extent of his basic knowledge, and try to build on it. When you have a group of students, there'll be different levels. Okay, there will be people who have a little more baseline knowledge than the others. So you actually pitch it for the student who actually has the lowest level of baseline knowledge. And then you build on it. You don't stop short there. You keep building on it. So you find that you have addressed all the students who are there in the group. Whereas if you address the lecture or the clinical teaching session to the one who knows the most, then you are leaving behind the students who are actually not at that level. So you need to start with the student whose level of knowledge is the lowest, and you build on it. In fact, we had a good system in Coimbatore Medical College where, unlike in CMC, we would have in the clinical years, final years, fourth years, and third year students, the first, second, third year clinical students, all posted in the same medical unit. And so the teachers would start at the level of the first clinical year student and go up to the final clinical year student. And that was very, very useful.
So I had a couple of questions. One is, what do you think about the teacher-student relationship and what role does that play in teaching and learning?
I think that's a very important question. See, there has to be the chemistry between the teacher and the taught. That is very important. And that should be established. It has to be nurtured. Okay. The relationship between the student and the teacher, it has to be nurtured. I think no student should say, I feel scared to go and approach this teacher. Students should feel that they are comfortable to reach out to a teacher and ask him for whatever. Okay. So there has to be a spirit of friendship, okay, between teacher and student. And I find that is very much there in CMC. Most of the time, I find that students do not hesitate to come up to you and ask you a question. And ask students to ask questions because that is how they learn. Okay, don't if however silly the question may sound, a question is very important because that is the starting point of learning.
Thank you, sir. My second question was, when you were a medical student, how did you learn? The theory, I'm sure there are some medical students who would want an answer to that question.
Theory, actually, in Coimbatore Medical College, we had access to a lot of clinical patients. Okay, so you would see a large number of patients in a given day. In the outpatient, the morning session would be from 7:30 to 9 in the OPD, where you'll be shown some 5-6 patients. Everything will be a short case. And then you go to the ward, you'll be allotted a case where you have to take a detailed history and so on. So you read up around these patients. By the time you are through your 3 years of clinical training, you would have virtually read whatever is required. Now, if you want to read theory, as I said, stick to a simple book. Don't take on a very complex book for your foundation. Okay, but know your simple book well. And in between, if you want to add on anything, you can always add it on. I used to have, I don't know whether you are familiar with this, called interleafing. Okay, you have a blank page after every page in a book. Okay, so what you do is you just go and make some tiny notes, some additional points. Okay, that used to help. I don't think it is in practice anymore because textbooks are all, I suppose, online. Even there, I'm sure you can introduce another page by the side where you can add 1 or 2 comments, which you can actually look up when you need.
So there's a question on the teaching a clinical team of doctor, nurses, and other disciplines. How to do that? Address the needs of different people individually or together.
No, I think teaching of the other healthcare workers has to be attuned to what they are supposed to know. Okay, what are the basic things that they need to know in order to function efficiently in their work environment. For example, if you are going to teach nurses something about the gastrointestinal system, I think, well, you need to teach them an overview of the gastrointestinal system, but you don't have to go into as great a detail as you would for, say, doctor in training. But you might have to emphasize certain aspects, like, say, passing a Rayleigh tube, so, small skills that they have to learn, and the practical things that they need to learn in order to be able to do that. Now, you need to emphasize those things. Okay, so you need to look at what their curriculum is, what is expected out of them. And of course, even there you'll have some students who are very smart and who will want to learn more. They should have the opportunity to learn. Same thing goes with technicians. I've had to take class for technicians, and when I take a class for a technician, I just need to know what is it that they need to know in their area of work, the pertinent medical knowledge that they need to have. So if you have an outline of that, then it's easy to formulate your lecture.
There's another question, sir, about the COVID situation. You've talked about COVID and how it gave you opportunity to learn, particularly in making what you think and know and your opinions available to a larger audience, as well as how to provide healthcare in a time of crisis like this. But the question is related to how do we use for online teaching and where there's a minimum exposure to patients. I think presumably this person who's asked the question is teaching in a medical college where less patients are there. But I think your comments on teaching at this time, I think you also what your experience has been in addressing the needs of the community at this time.
I'll tell you what we did for teaching our patients and families in the community. We made a lot of handouts that can be given. These are small pamphlets emphasizing use of the mask, cocooning the elderly, and simple things like maintaining a distance. And we sent SMS, okay, so through the mobile phones to all the people living there. I also made some short video clips on various aspects of what needs to be done at the community level in the form of questions and answers. Okay, so it was like a question followed by an answer. I made several video clips, and these were again sent through the mobile phones. And so virtually everybody living in the community had an opportunity to listen, and it was all in the regional language, so that was easy to understand. It was pitched at the level of the layman, so it was quite well received. So you need to know what you want, what is the message you want to convey, the medium in which you want to convey it, and the format. The format, I think question answers are very useful. Okay. Instead of stating facts one after the other, that tends to be boring. You ask a question and then you give an answer, then people find it very useful indeed.
Yeah, yesterday at the medicine conference, we had a talk by Dr. Sudha Jasmine about how to teach where you don't have access to patients, and some of the, based on her own experience, she was talking about teaching final year students clinical medicine. So some activities that they got them to do were actually to work on their physical examination methods, take a video and send it to the teacher. The other is to identify patients and relatives whom students can phone and talk and ask the history. And where you can use a video as a way of also assessing whether students can actually do the skill that you have asked them to do. It's a different challenge altogether where we are using online teaching to deal with clinical medicine. And I think that moving to getting students to do activities around cases, developing their ways of thinking, history taking, analytical skills. So there are ways that we have to work to circumvent the current situation till we can move to a time when we can actually bring students into the wards. And I think the period of the coming year will also be challenging in that respect. How do we bring students in the ward? How do we develop skills when they can come in, even with more infection control, smaller groups? So it's going to be a challenging time. But the other aspect of the challenge in education at this time is in a new disease where you're having large scale death. How do you equip people who are working and taking care of COVID-19? And often these are people from different disciplinary backgrounds, from anatomy, physiology to OG, surgery, people in handling the problem of COVID-19. And that is another area where education has to put um, its effort, and we have some experience with that as well.
I think the situation should be looked upon as both a challenge and an opportunity. Okay. So the challenge is there, no doubt. But then if you look upon the challenge as an opportunity to improvise, then you'll do well. Okay. So you have to constantly improvise to make sure that the online learning for the students is as close to the real experience as possible.
So I was wondering two things. One, when accessing information is not a problem today. In fact, we probably have an information overload. So what principles would you advise today's student in that domain? How to appropriately access information? And the second question was, what were your principles in imparting attitudes such as empathy, responsibility to your trainees?
Well, to answer the first question, which was about, can you just tell me the first part of the question?
Yes. How to cope with information overload
All
and
right. Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Basically, I said you teach students how to learn. So it is contained in that simple line. Okay. Now, Dr. Anand, he was talking about journal clubs. Okay. Now, if you organize the journal club in such a way that the articles that are read are criticized, dissected, analyzed, and a final conclusion arrived at. If you teach them the method of doing it, then they will do it on their own. Because one of the problems with the information overload that you have is that the information may not be contextual. It may not be applicable to where you are practicing medicine. Number two, the information may have some biases built in. You need to be able to get over those biases. And you have to be able to tell the difference between an article that will withstand the test of time and an article that will be there for a year and then vanish. Okay. Now, that art of analyzing an article and coming to the right conclusions can be taught very well in a good journal club where many people, senior and junior, participate. And the choice of the article also is important. I think it is uh, good for the senior people in the department to tell a student to bring out a particular article to highlight certain aspects of this. Okay, so to do it very well, then it's not difficult.
I think the other question was about what Reena was asking, also links to another question that has come out about teaching students the art of medicine. Uh, and I think she was also linking to
Yeah,
attitudes. Yeah.
I think that is very closely linked to Reena's second question. How
Yes,
do
sir.
you teach students empathy? Empathy is something that students make out very readily when they see their teachers dealing with patients with a lot of empathy. It is something that they observe, experience, and then absorb. Okay. So if you are empathetic to a patient, and if a group of students posted with you actually see you do that, that is when they acquire that. That's when they acquire that particular trait. And it happens over several years. It's not over, after all, the medical curriculum is over several years. Okay. How you respect patients, how you deal with them, how you patiently explain to them, how you are able to put yourself in the patient's shoes. Now, these are things that they just imbibe by being around when you practice the art and science of medicine.
So many of the cases that you've highlighted are all teaching cases, and one thing that's been written something about uh, learning how to teach by watching teachers teach and highly experienced teachers. So one term that is used in the education literature is what are called teaching scripts. That good teachers have teaching scripts which they use frequently. I can even remember some teaching scripts maybe that I referred to, like, using the ophthalmoscope to diagnose Wilson's disease. But I think each of your cases has stories about things that we take back from a story, which we keep in our in our minds for a lifetime. So when we encounter a similar case, we can remember that, and you brought out very nice examples of that. So as a teacher who's how do we get these nuggets? And it's in a way it is very different from what is traditionally taught in medical education, that you have a certain knowledge and skills, and the teacher has to get the students to know certain amount of information, get a skill. But you're saying that learning is not linear, and there are these cases you feel you get experience with, and then suddenly you get a bit of information, you may not even know it, and then later when you encounter a problem it comes back. So what are your comments on how we develop this kind of case-based knowledge, and how to apply it, how to teach it?
Basically, I feel that the most important function of the human brain is forming associations. Okay. You associate something with something else. For example, you associate a particular physical sign with a particular disease. You associate a particular type of handwriting with a particular disease. Associate a particular symptom with a particular disease. I think that is the way students will learn. Okay. So even though it will be very interesting to talk about what are the changes in the patient in a parietal lobe lesion, the experience is totally different when an experienced teacher shows you a patient with a particular symptom and he says, look, this happens with a brain disease. You go and look up and figure out for yourself and you come back and tell me. That experience is what really lasts. All right. If you sit and read about the parietal lobe, after a 5-10 minute period, you might go to sleep. All right. But when you have seen a patient with a problem, and when you read in that context, then it stays with you. That's because there is a visual thing that you have seen, there is something that you have heard, then you are going to read up about it. So the brain forms associations with all these. And this is all stored away, right? And this is what I said, a complex imprint is left in your brain, which surfaces every now and then. And you can call it intuition or you can call it whatever, but then these complex impressions that are carried in your brain are the ones that actually surface to help you in making a very good clinical diagnosis. Okay. So there are the patterns. You remember everything as actually a pattern in your mind. Okay. You don't remember everything as actually a discrete line or a sentence. You remember everything as a pattern, and that pattern recognition comes very quickly. It's not difficult at all, provided you see enough number of patients. That's why I said, the bedside teaching, and the larger the number of patients to whom the student is exposed, I think that actually has the greatest merit in terms of teaching clinical science.
I suppose it's a little bit like the difference between reading a recipe book versus practicing and experimenting with cooking, the way one remembers and then teaches somebody else. Probability and pattern recognition is another thing one of my teachers used to talk about. Depending on the context, the probability of a disease being one thing or another varies. And then one multiplies that probability with the pattern that one sees, and somewhere deep inside a synthesis happens. What would you say, sir?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are many areas in learning, whether it is the kitchen or whether it is the hospital. You learn a lot by doing small experiments, and these experiments are often carried out by you as part of your day-to-day work, and you might modify things a little bit. You may not exactly do this is what I meant by improvisation. You need to be able to improvise. See, if you teach a student just the basics and also give him the skills of how to learn, then after that he will, over a period of time, actually learn things and he will improve upon what he has learned. That's why I said I have learned many things from my students. Okay, so I might have a particular way of eliciting a physical sign. I find a student doing it a little better and more effectively. I adopt that. It's as simple as that. So it is a constant process of learning and mild changes made here and there. Okay. But, there is a saying, if you want to learn medicine only from books, then it is, it's a bit like not going to sea at all. But if you want to learn medicine without books, it is like going to an uncharted sea. All right. So you need both. You need the books and you need the patients. And between the two, I think patients are the more important.
Yeah, Dr. Seshadri's stories and the role of intuition in diagnosis and how to bring back knowledge that you have from the past. So this week I was rounding in the Chittoor campus, and there was this young lady who came with stroke, and she was only some 20 years old. And the first thought that I had was a similar case I'd seen long ago in cardiology of a young lady with arthritis. And so the first thing I asked the doctors there to do is to just check the upper limb pulses. And like in 5 seconds, we had the diagnosis because of the unequal pulses. So what is that intuition that led to that diagnosis? And I think a prepared mind is always able to quickly come to make associations and make diagnosis. And it's a case of the young patient who came with vomiting and hypokalemia and seizures. We had a similar patient who, a young girl who was studying in 11th standard and very high performing student, and had come to the casualty with hypoglycemia, and came with coma and woke up very quickly. And like Dr. Sheshadri used to teach us, we were taking all the history for a spontaneous hypoglycemia. We didn't know why, and so she was there for us for a few days. She woke up. We couldn't find any pancreatic neoplasm. We tried checked for the fasting hypoglycemia. It was not there. And then on the day of discharge, she gently laid out to the registrar that she'd actually taken her grandfather's oral anti-diabetic drugs because the exam was there in a few days. And I think that it took some time, but that carefully listening to the patient gave us. And I think some of the learnings that you brought out in that case are relevant. And I think so. We all develop these kind of case histories in our head, and a good teacher is able to convey it to others and bring those associations together. And I'm sure that each of the participants in today's meeting will actually have their own example of such cases. I'm also reminded of Dr. Sheshadri's own experience with back pain, and myself having had to have back pain and learn a lot from physiotherapists. And that is also what I teach my patients, what I learned from them. So I think that I would, do the participants have examples that they would like to share about how they have learned, like what Dr. Sheshadri is speaking about? We can't unmute, right? If we can unmute you, so you can unmute and speak as well. So one of the things that we have noted you to do is we look forward to your newspaper articles, often with Dr. Jacob John, and your views on different matters. And what is your comment on the role of a physician in terms of creating public opinion and advocacy and public education?
I think belatedly, I have realized this is important. I mean, I had written to the newspaper earlier when I was still working in CMC. This was about medical education. I think we had a meeting and then we decided that the current way of undergraduate education has to change. And so we wrote an article. I think I wrote it with K. Jacob. Now that after that, I had not written at all till Dr. Jacob John told me that you have to write. Okay. Of course, I had the time. I think that's important. See, you need to have the time. It is a fairly time-consuming uh, thing to do because you have to write in such a way that the average person will be able to get a clear understanding, even of matters that are a little complicated. So that is the difficult part. But when you do it, you realize that it has a lot of value because people really understand what is being said, and they actually write back and ask you certain questions which are very perceptive. Okay, so you find that it is a very important function of the medical profession. See, we cannot say we look after only our patients. You do have a responsibility for the society in which you live.
Yeah.
Meenu, please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I was looking after the students in Gulf Medical University, Tumbe Medical College in Ajman in UAE, and we had introduced interprofessional teaching. That is, we used to take a case, say, where the dentist, the physiotherapist, the students, basically, they all got together, they formed a team, they met about 2-3 times, and then they had a PowerPoint presentation with the patient sitting there, and the whole all the other students and their teachers used to attend these sessions. And then this way we kind of got to know the role of each person and how they look at and how they diagnose and what is important for them in a patient. So then the other person actually realizes what the other discipline is being taught and how important their role also is in treating a patient. So we had these sessions, and I used to sort of, before the session was actually put on air, or we used to just go through a rehearsal to see that it's not too long, and only the relevant points. Like for the pharmacology student, they were more worried about the dose of the drug and the side effect of the drug, the interactions of the drug. So that's what we used to go through, and it was very helpful for everybody, I thought. So just a comment on that.
Dr. Aarti, would you like to unmute and tell us about your case that you learned something from? Thank you, sir, for this lecture. I think my take-home message from this lecture is that as a senior teacher with about, since you have been teaching me itself, it's about 40 years, and longer still, your whole career in teaching. I think what you're emphasizing is that we don't learn linearly, and that we learn from cases, and seeing a lot of cases is very important. Attention to bedside medicine and careful history, careful physical observation, seeing what doesn't fit in and trying to solve the puzzle, and this receptiveness to learning from different members, not only your teachers, but your colleagues and your students and your other people you work with, and most importantly, from the patient. And that trying to ask questions as a way of uh, helping students to learn, posing questions to them, which can, even if they don't have answers, it forces them to think and I think that the key question can often help a student move forward. And I think you've these are some of the things that you have highlighted, and I think your array of cases could be written into a small book itself, which can help us to learn how things that you have learned and how you are putting that to teaching right now. So thank you very much, sir, for sharing this all with us. And I'm going to hand over to Reena right now to conclude today's session.
Thank you all for joining in. Thank you, Dr. Zachariah and Dr. Seshadri, for reminding us again that basically it is simple principles, simple books, a year to listen, and the desire to learn and to teach how to learn. Thank you and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you to all the participants for joining us this afternoon.